Welcome to React Advanced London. I'm Rob Richardson, and we're going to learn about gaining confidence with Cypress tests. Here's the part where I tell you I am definitely going to post the slides on my site tonight. I've been that person chasing the speaker, and it's never worked out very well for me either, which is why you can head to robrich.org right now, click on presentations here at the top, and here's Gaining Confidence with Cypress tests. The slides and the code are available online. While we're here at robrich.org, let's click on About Me, and we'll see some of the things that I've done recently. I'm a Cyril developer advocate. If you're having trouble taming your data mesh, let's chat. I'm also a Microsoft MVP, a Docker captain, a friend of Redgate, and AZ GiveCamp is really fun. AZ GiveCamp brings volunteer developers together with charities to build free software. We start Friday after work. Sunday afternoon, we deliver the completed software to the charities. Sleep is optional, caffeine provided. If you're in Phoenix, come join us for the next AZ GiveCamp, or if you'd like a GiveCamp here in London or wherever you're connecting from, hit me up on email or Twitter, and let's get a GiveCamp in your neighborhood too. Some of the other things that I've done, I was a core contributor to Gulp in version 2 and version 3, and I replied to a .NET Rocks podcast episode. They read my comment on the air, and they sent me a mug. Woohoo! So there's my claim to fame, my coveted .NET Rocks mug. So let's dig in with gaining confidence with Cypress tests. Now, I'm not quite sure how this talk is going to go, so let me fire up this thing and let's see if my site is ready. Now, our first step is to do a TypeScript build, so let's kick that off. Once we've got our TypeScript build, then we'll start executing each of our tests. Looks good so far. It's working pretty well. Yep. It looks like this test is going to work out pretty well. Yep, my site is functioning well. That's great. That's awesome. It looks like my site will work and this talk will turn out just fine. We saw browser-based functional testing in Cypress. That was pretty cool. Or said differently, we saw end-to-end tests. Cypress is that mechanism for running experiences in the browser, much like a user would. It's an Electron app and a browser plugin, and is built on top of Mocha and Chai. Like many good stories, we started in the middle. Let's back up and start at the beginning. Let's talk about browser testing. As I'm doing browser testing, I'll probably create tests in each of these categories. I might have a test around a specific unit of work, a specific business service. Or I might test an API, maybe it's GraphQL or gRPC or REST. I might test this service. Now, that's not a web service, but rather a business service. And I might want to test that service running in a particular browser. I might want to test components, where I'm still doing unit tests, so I'm maybe mocking child components. And for each of these, I might use different tools. If I want to test a small unit of work, I would use Mocha with Chai or Jest or maybe Jasmine. If I wanted to validate that those tests run in a particular browser, I would use Karma. Now, Karma doesn't do end-to-end tests, rather it runs unit tests inside of a browser. If I want to validate a particular component, I might take my Mocha or Jest tests and also include the test utils library. There's a test utils version for each SPA framework. If I want to test my API, I don't need a browser at all. I can just fire web requests at it, check the status code in the response body. If I want to do end-to-end tests, I could use Selenium, Cypress, Test Cafe, or Playwright. As you grab these slides from robrich.org, you can click on each of these blue links to learn more about that particular library. Let's double-click into end-to-end tests. I could use Selenium. Selenium uses WebDriver, and you can program this in lots of different languages. Now, Selenium is known for making fragile and brittle tests. It knows nothing of the browser. It's merely controlling the mouse and looking at the DOM or the HTML. So if the API wasn't ready yet, I could, rerun my tests. That makes my test brittle. Or I could extend the timeout. That makes my test slow. Selenium is known for slow and brittle tests. By comparison, if I use Cypress, Cypress is a browser plugin. So I can wait for the DOM to be ready or for that API call to be done. If it's 10 milliseconds or 1 second, that's when my tests will continue on. Now, Cypress being deeply integrated into the browser, you can only write those tests in JavaScript. But you can take videos and screenshots along the way, which is perfect. Next up, Test Cafe. If you use Dev Express for other content, you might feel right at home with Test Cafe. Now with Test Cafe, it's not using Mocha or Jest for its assertion library, so it'll feel a little weird. You also spend a lot of time marshalling content between the test context and the browser context. Next up, Playwright. Playwright was written by the makers of Puppeteer, and so if you're familiar with test driving Chrome with Puppeteer, you'll feel right at home with Playwright. Playwright's assertion syntax does feel like kind of a bolt-on though, so you might not have great success there, but you can use it in many different languages. So ultimately, which test frameworks you use is definitely up to you, and pick the one that matches your preferences. Let's take a look at Cypress today. The first step I'll do is I'll do an npm install of Cypress and then npx cypress open. Once I do an npx cypress open, it will scaffold out a whole lot of content in place to make it easier to get started with Cypress. So I've done that here, and we can see all of the different scaffolded tests that it built automatically. Now by default, it will be in JavaScript, but I've chosen to make my tests in TypeScript instead. Now I can choose which browser I run it on, and it will discover all of the browsers that I have installed on my machine, and it comes with an Electron browser, which is a Chromium-based browser. Now in this case, it's noting that I have a Chrome-specific flag that Firefox doesn't understand. That's okay. Now I can choose to run all my tests, or I can choose to run a particular test. So we saw how we launched this test, and we're able to validate that content. Now this is, we'll notice that here's my regular Chrome, and here's a new Chrome. It's launched a new profile to ensure none of my plugins or saved forms interfere with the test run. Now, it is just a browser, so I can do interesting things, I can open other browser tabs, and my tests will continue to run. It's not like I need to walk away from my machine when I have my test run. Now, the tests will run each step in my content and be able to validate that my tests work as expected. But this is just a browser, so if I open up the F12 developer tools, I can switch over to this sources tab and I can take a look at my tests. So if I want to set a breakpoint in my tests, I can now hit refresh and start to debug through my tests with just normal F10 and F11 debug tools. I can also switch over to the console tab and see the console output at each step. So here's the console output at this step and at this step, and I can see that console output for each of the tests. Closing the F12 developer tools, I can take a look at the content at each step, but I can also take a look at, for example, where it clicked. It clicked right here to be able to accomplish that task. Now I can use this tool to be able to select things. We'll come back to selectors, but here's the exact code that I need to be able to select this object were I to put that in my test. I can also choose to rerun my tests and take a look at successes and failures. Now that's great. We got to see how this IDE worked, and it worked out really well. Now let's take a look at the content behind this. Now we were testing the to-do MVC site. Now it is a smidge dated, but we have examples of MVC in various frameworks, and the to-do MVC project then collects these so that we can start to compare frameworks. So I have my tests, and let's pop open our Cypress project. Here's cypress.json, and that's the first file that we'll take a look at. Now cypress.json's job is to point us to this plugins file. In this case, I have it in a TypeScript project, so I'll go into test/cypress, plugins, and here's my plugins.index.html. And this will then define the folders for all of the rest of the content in my Cypress project. My fixtures are here in the fixtures folder. My integration folder, that's where all my unit tests are. I have snapshots and videos in the results folder to make sure that they're excluded from source control. And we'll come back to support files that are here. Next up, I've chosen to make my tests in TypeScript. Now this is the base TS config in my project, and it doesn't have any details of TypeScript. This is just the TypeScript definition, the build definition that I would have as part of my project. Now here inside the test Cypress folder, I also have a TS config file. Now these are the specific overrides that I need to be able to launch Cypress from TypeScript. Note that I've extended the previous TypeScript, the tsconfig file, so that I only need to override those pieces that are specific to TypeScript. In my package.json file, I've chosen to create some shortcuts to be able to do npx cypress open. So I'll say npm run cy:\open, and that will launch the IDE. I can also run cy:\run from my automated build, and that will run the headless build. Pardon me. I can identify specific browsers. So in this case, here's Chrome and Firefox running in headless mode, and I can then string them together. So if I say npm test, it will run Chrome and Firefox and Edge and validate that my tests work in all three browsers. That's perfect. So let's take a look at the test that we wrote to accomplish this. Now I'm testing the to-do MVC project, and so I could switch between various implementations. In this case, I'm looking at the AngularJS version. I go grab the site name so that I can put it in my describe block in a really elegant way. And then before each test, I'm going to go visit that site. Now I do this just to validate so that I don't have to do this cy.visit at the beginning of each test, but I definitely could if I wanted to. Now let's do a hello world test where we just go grab the URL and it should equal that site URL. Now this was really helpful. When I originally wrote this talk, this site was HTTP, not HTTPS. And so it was really helpful for me to notice that I wasn't testing what I expected. If you refactor your website, it could be nice to know if this content is 301 or 302 to a new page, that you're not testing what you expect. Now next, let's take a look at the to-do list. We haven't entered any to-dos, so this to-do list should not exist. Perfect. Now, depending on the spot implementation, it might exist but be blank, but ultimately we're looking for the li items within the list, so this might be a safe assumption. Next, let's level up and start interacting with the page. I've got some content and I want to type that in the to-do box. So let's go select the new to-do box and type that content and push enter. Notice that there's a $sign here and not here. This curly brace, enter curly brace, is so that we can enter unique commands, shift, option, control, F keys, anything weird that we want to type, we can type in this way. So once I've done that, then I'll go grab the to-do list and validate that it contains my new to-do. Now notice that there's no awaits here. As soon as we finish typing that content, it will wait for all of the browser events to finish before Cypress gets on to the next line. So let's go validate that our to-do box is now blank, and now we've added a to-do. That's perfect. Let's mark a to-do as completed. So I'll start by creating this irrelevant to-do because I want to make sure that I'm completing the correct one. Then I'll mark my new to-do that I want to do and validate that I can get there. So let's go grab that view that matches this new to-do and go grab the children, the toggle button. Now I'll click that toggle button and that will mark that task as finished. So what does it mean to be finished? Well, it should have this class of completed, and I'll go validate that by selecting that to-do item. Perfect. Now we've been able to start to interact with the page in a really elegant way. Next up, let's delete a to-do. So I'll type an irrelevant to-do, I'll type this new to-do, I'll go grab that to-do and go find the destroy button. Now the destroy button is only visible if we mouse over it. And we're doing JavaScript events. We're not doing DOM events. So we don't get that CSS mouse over. There is no mouse movement in this case. So I'm going to say force is true to be able to click it even though it's not visible. Perfect. Now we should only have one left because one of them was marked as finished. And we can see that it should only be the irrelevant to do, not the one that I marked as completed. Perfect. Now, as I start to type these things, I'm getting kind of redundant. I want to show only active tasks, but I don't want to just keep doing this again. Let's create a new command called to-do add. Now this to-do add command, I'll take in my thing, and it will be able to do those steps associated with creating the new to-do. So here in my commands, I have an index.ts that says just import those commands. Here's my commands, and I have this to-do add command. It takes in a string, it types it in the box, and I'm right here. I may as well just validate that that box is now empty. Perfect. Back in my test, I now can describe the user's interactions. I want to add 3 new to-dos. If you've ever used Selenium's page object, this will feel right at home. Let's do a similar thing for complete. And so we have a complete action, which will go grab the view, click on the toggle, and mark that as complete. Now we're starting to describe users' interactions, so our test is both more terse and more descriptive. Great. Let's go grab the active button, and we will click it and validate that we only are showing 2 now that we're only filtering by active tasks. Finishing out this test, we'll do similar things using our new actions and grab the completed button and validate that we now only are showing that 1 that we've marked completed. And we'll do a similar thing of clicking the clear completed button, validating that we no longer have any. Now this was great to be able to level up through the various functions in Cypress. Next, let's start to talk about network interactions. Similar to To-Do MVC, we have Hacker News PWA. Now, we can say this is a spiritual successor to To-Do MVC. It creates a PWA that shows Hacker News details. Now, it's great because I can do it in lots of different frameworks, but I don't know what the stories will be on Hacker News. So how do I validate that that content is correct? Let's fire up this test and take a look at how it works. Here's my Hacker News PWA test. And as it does that test, it will actually pull down the real stories from Hacker News. There's our TypeScript compile, and Cypress is noticing when any files change. So it restarted the test knowing that that TypeScript compile just finished. Okay, let's do our Hello World test. That works out great. Now let's go visit the Hacker News site to go get details. Now, we could create some fake stories to be able to validate that that test is as expected, but it would be really unfortunate if we only used fake data, because we could easily lie to ourselves and not show actual test content. So let's take a look at that. Let's look at our Hacker News PWA. Now, in this case, I chose the Angular 2 version, but we could also look at the next version or the next version. I'll start off by visiting that page every time. And let's go validate that the URL is as expected. Next, we want to have a specific top story. Now, I don't know what the top story is on Hacker News, so there's no way for me to validate that. But I can intercept this web request. In this case, I chose a regular expression, but we could also use a string here. And whenever the application makes a request to this, I'm going to intercept it and instead return this fixture. Here's this fixture, the Hacker News. And so now I know that this is the first story, will be the first story in my list. So there's my expected result. And as I go visit that Hacker News site, then I should get that title in my results. Perfect. Now, it would be easy for me to lie to myself and presume that my fixture is exactly what the API will return. And in this case, we'll go hit the actual web request, not mock it out, to validate that my API shape is as expected. I'm going to assume that Hacker News has 30 or more stories on it. Now, if this API request was going to take a really long time, I could choose to name it as a particular thing and then specifically cy.wait. But in this case, the Hacker News API returns quick enough and I don't need to. So we got to see great examples of how to be able to build tests in Cypress in various ways, and we leveled up through different interactions, from web requests to interacting with the page, validating and selecting particular DOM elements, creating commands to be able to simplify and be more descriptive in our tests, and ultimately intercepting web requests. Now, one of the things that we want to look at is best practices associated with Cypress. As we're starting to do our selectors, we could definitely create the CSS selector with a big full path showing all of the divs, how to get from here to there. But if we were to refactor our page, all of that would be for naught. Instead, create a specific selector that identifies an ID or a class. Or even better, create a data-cy element on your particular element, and then specify that in your test. cy.get data-cy equals that particular thing. Now, the beauty here is that not only are you getting exactly the element that you want every time, even if it gets moved around on the page, but you're also documenting that a test is responsible for this particular content. That can be really helpful. Now, are you leaking your test content into production? Yes, but wouldn't it be great to also run tests in production? Maybe every hour or so, I'm going to fire up my homepage. I'm going to get into the product catalog. I'm going to put one piece in my shopping cart. I'm going to get to the checkout page. I won't enter a credit card number. I won't finish the purchase. But wouldn't it be cool if you could run that test for all of your hot paths in production and know if your infrastructure went down before your customers call? That would be ideal. So this data-cy mechanism both makes it easier to document that a test is associated with it and allows you to run tests in production. Next up, let's use commands. We saw how we could use commands to create a simpler mechanism for being able to identify the steps in our tests. Now, the backing content now could be reused in interesting ways, and our tests are much more terse and descriptive. Next up, avoid logging in on every test. We definitely do want to validate the login experience, but we only want to do that once. Instead, at the beginning of all tests, go hit an API and get a token that you can use for the rest of the tests. Now, maybe this is a dev-only API, or maybe you're just hitting the backend page that the login experience would call. Once you've got that token, use that token in all the rest of the tests. You do want to validate your login experience, but you don't want to validate it at the beginning of every test. That'll make your test slower. Next up, use mocks to be able to use fixtures to be able to take reusable data and move it out of your test content into a more reusable spot. It'll make your tests more terse, more shorter, and allow you to reuse that across various tests. Now, in this case, we had a fixture that we could use to mock out the Hacker News data. Now, this is great. We can attach that to a particular web request via cy.intercept. And if anything happened, now we can start to validate that our controls render as expected. You can click on the blue link here in the slides that you get from robrich.org to get to the code associated with accomplishing that. This has been fun to be able to show you Cypress and to be able to wander through all of the different pieces. You can grab this code at robrich.org and hit me up on Twitter at rob_rich. You can also join me at that spot where the conference is designated for live Q&A. Thanks for joining us here at React Advanced London.